Hi, welcome back. Hearing the dead speak. Now, one reason I'm fascinated by folklore and the oral tradition of storytelling is because it creates a lineage, a link with the past. So, in a sense, it's a way of uh, accessing how our ancestors would have perceived the world, because a lot of that is encoded in the myths and folklore that we tell and that we are preserving as storytellers. So, in a sense, and this is quite fitting for this time of year because it's Samhain or Halloween, storytelling is hearing the dead speak. But what about actually hearing the dead speak? Is it possible to communicate with those that have crossed over with our ancestors or even the very recently departed? So my last video was about the Yew Tree, which is a tree of the dead and of the ancestors. And I mentioned in that video that my mum had recently passed away earlier this year, which was sort of why I wanted to touch on yew as a tree of contact with the ancestors. So if you haven't seen that video, go and check it out if you want. But I was going to attach this little video onto the end of that one, but it was getting a bit long. So I just wanted to share some stories with you guys, if you're interested, about times I personally have felt that I've communicated with my mum. We've just had Samhain or Halloween. Funny thing happened. My dad comes to my shed over there that I live in on the farm, and he says to me that he had had a dream about mum, except it wasn't a dream. He said it was sort of like a apparition, a visitation. My dad's not a spiritual man, and he also doesn't know the thing about Samhain, about this time of year, that it's one of the thin places where spirits that have crossed over may come back and visit. This is what my dad said to me. He said he had walked into a pub of some description, a lobby, and seen mum sat there smiling at him, dressed all in black, and she was sort of glowing a black light, and she was just smiling. Just that's all it was. And I thought that was very interesting. So I wanted to share with you a few stories about other times that I personally have felt that my mum's been speaking to me. And if you've had any similar experiences like this, let me know in the comments. Do please like and subscribe if you like my videos. But I just wanted to share some of those with you, culminating in a particular dream I had a few weeks ago, and this was what you might call a big dream. So there's a few categories to this. When my mum first passed, in those first few days, we were all in a kind of liminal state anyway. And in Tibetan religion, you get something called the bardo, right? The in-between state. It probably exists in a lot of other metaphysical systems as well. But I kind of feel that my mum, because she died so suddenly, didn't realize that she was dead and didn't know where she was, so would come back to places that were familiar to her. I saw her standing in her garden, in her walled garden right here. Just a flash, almost out of the periphery of my vision, almost like I could have imagined it, but it was just a bit more solid than that. I saw her a few times like that, sitting at the dinner table suddenly, sometimes in the chair in my shed. She was just sat there smiling at me. But when I looked up and focused on it, she was gone. I heard her call my name, almost like she was lost or frightened. I heard her say, as if I'd heard it in my own ear hole, Ollie, she said, Ollie, 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 again and again and again. And I would almost be looking around as if looking for her. It has to be said, I wasn't mentally all there then. I was in a bit of a liminal state as well, but I sometimes think that maybe mum was sort of trying to find us or trying to figure out what had happened, or sort of haunting the places she was familiar with. Funny thing happened on the very night she died. We had some friends down from the village and we were talking about her, and the air sort of curdled in the room, and one of my neighbours said, I feel that she's here. And we all went quiet, and at that moment a head of a tulip bulb that my mum had bought just 2 days before just dropped on the table, and we all just looked at it and we all just sort of knew. Obviously this is subjective, but just instinct, I feel, plays a part in this. Still got that tulip bulb. So that was in the first few days. Sort of visitations, audio hallucinations, and sort of poltergeist type activity. You know, stuff moved around a little bit. It was just a bit odd. Then after that, maybe 7 day period, just in all the months since, really, often if I'm addressing my mum, sometimes I fancy that I can hear her answer in the patterns of nature, whether it's just some starlings will fly overhead, or the wind will pick up in the trees, or just the pattern of the clouds will change slightly, or the sun will come out. That's traditionally a folkloric thing. People associate songbirds and weather with the dead speaking. And a few times that had happened. Without going into any details, I would ask a very specific question and something would happen. Confirmation bias, you might say, if you're of a more skeptical mindset, but it didn't feel that way, and there's a lot of subjectivity in this as well, of course. Other times I've heard my mum's voice in my head quite loudly. I've got a neurodivergent condition, so I do hear voices anyway, but it's more than just imagining a voice. There's no predecessor to the thought. It comes right out. So at one point I was sat on this bench right here, right in front of my mum's grave. I was sat there with my girlfriend. It was mum's birthday, so we had poured her some Prosecco because she loved Prosecco. And I poured it, just a half glass because she's not physically going to drink it, is she? And I poured it in and I heard her voice clear as day. Is that all I get? Which is exactly the kind of thing she would say. But I heard it. And then, so I just sort of giggled and poured a bit more in. And she said, that's more like it. I heard it in my head. That same evening, I was sat there and my girlfriend says, do you think she is something, referring to my mum? And I again heard the voice. It was, who's she? The cat's mother, And that again, so mum kept doing this and I just kept giggling to myself because she was just particularly chatty. It was her birthday, she's got a right to be. So that's that. Now, the last potential, arguable contact I had with my mum was a dream I had a couple of months ago. Felt like a big dream. In this dream, I was a teenager. I was at school. I live in England, so and I went to a boarding school, and I wasn't very happy at this time. And in this dream, I ran away from school. And I sort of escaped into the town and was walking down the high street. And at the end of the high street, there was this big, round, glass hotel, sort of like, just sort of a big glass, spherical, cylindrical hotel stretching up into the sky. The big hotel in the sky. Obviously, my subconscious isn't very imaginative, thinking about metaphors for death. But I enter this, enter the sort of slightly futuristic glass door of this hotel, and I'm going up the sort of escalator of this hotel, and there's many floors and many doors set out in concentric sort of rings, and many of them it said occupied, but some of the doors were open. And I just got the sense that in every one of these doors in this dream hotel were lives. You could sort of see time, linear time, and some of them were empty. The people had moved out, and the hotel cleaners had moved in. And I just got a very strong sense that there were lives, individual sort of streams of existence behind every hotel door, and most of them occupied. And I was looking for Mum, and I knew Mum was in here somewhere. Until I got to the very top, and there was sort of like a lobby area, like a waiting room with glass coffee tables and magazines. And there was my mum in the waiting room in the sky. Again, subconscious, not very subtle. So there Mum was, and she was like, darling. And she was so happy to see me, and we had a really nice chat, and it was so lovely. And I just couldn't quite, I knew there was something up. I couldn't quite figure out why I was so happy to see her. And we chatted about all sorts of things, very few I can remember now. But then she suddenly grew very, very worried and concerned, and I knew something was wrong. And I asked her, what's the matter, Mum? Is there something you're not telling me? Are you ill? like, do you have a terminal disease or something? And she was just looked down and she said, oh, I'm just so worried. I'm just so worried about all the stress with all the bills and the farm, and don't want to lose the farm. And I just remember reassuring her and say, don't worry, Mum, like, if we lose the farm, we lose the farm. Hey, your happiness is more important than anything. Just don't worry about all this stuff. Everything's going to be fine. And you could just feel all this weight lifting off her, and she was really happy. And then something clicked. I don't know if any of you have lucid dreams, but I suddenly realized something was up. And I realized, hang on, this is a dream. And I looked at my mum and I said, wait a minute, you're dead, aren't you? And she looked right at me. Right, I remember this in the dream so much because everything became vivid, like in a lucid dream. You know, you suddenly realize, holy crap, I'm in a dream. I'm in an imagined space now. And she looked at me and said, yeah, I'm dead. And it was very, you know, the whole sort of fabric of the dream was vibrating at this point. You know, I'm looking at my hands going, holy crap, this is really real. And I remember asking my mum, I was like, I've got to find out this. And I asked her, is this really you? Or is this just my subconscious creating this? I really wanted to know that. And she looked at me and said, it's both. That's what she said. Now, maybe that's just in my dream, but I think that's just an interesting thing to think of when we think of, are these visitations, is it all in the mind, or is there actually a conscious entity there trying to connect with us? Because metaphysically, sometimes I juggle with that, and I don't know what you think. You know, if rebirth is true, like what the ancient Celts believe, like what the Buddhists believe, how can an entity, is there just a certain amount of time they can communicate with us before, you know, they're gone? Does the conscious stream split into two? Or is it all just in our heads? But anyway, Dream Mum said, it's both. And then she said, come on, darling, I think it's time you went back to school. And she drove me back to school, and I walked back in the gates. And then I woke up. Thank you very much for listening to my stories. Interested to hear in the comments any of your experiences communicating with your loved ones that have passed over. And if you haven't seen my Yew Tree video, do check it out, or some of my other tree videos and other stories. I'll be back again soon. Have a nice day.